So to keep us all on time, first of all, thank everybody, including Dr. Edgar, for their ability to pivot very quickly this morning. Dr. Edgar is the Senior Vice President for Competencies, Milestones, and Faculty Development at the ACGME. She provides leadership for the oversight, development, innovation, and maintenance of domestic and international competencies, the milestones, and faculty development. She serves as an ACGME ambassador to and collaborator with stakeholders, both internal as well as external, including program directors, certification boards, medical specialty groups, to advance the implementation of competencies, milestones, faculty development, and other ACGME initiatives. Dr. Edgar sent information to us a couple weeks ago so that you guys can get a basic foundation of what she's going to cover today. The small groups are going to probably have to pivot a little bit just because it's a little bit different when it's virtual as opposed to when it's in person, but we're going to try to stick to the schedule to the best of our abilities. So without further ado, I will let Dr. Edgar take it from there.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much. And yes, it was one of those really interesting mornings. I am sitting in my my home office here in the south suburbs of Chicago, where it is bright and sunny, but apparently my connection that was supposed to go through Dallas just was doomed not to happen today. So I appreciate everybody's willingness to be so flexible, and this way we didn't have to cancel. So I'm so thankful for that. Let me start by telling everybody I am extremely flexible in my presentations. At any point, if you have a question, please ask it. If you have a question, somebody else has a question and they just don't want to ask it. If you don't want to say it out loud, go ahead and put it in the chat. However you want to do it. I want to make sure that we get all of your questions answered. I do feel like you might not get as much information because I do feel like sometimes when you have to stare at a screen, your brain does tend to wander a little bit more than when you've got somebody walking around standing in front of you. And I completely understand that. So, again, if you need to take a little break, I get that. And the good news is I won't watch you walk out, right? So I am going to go ahead and share my screen. And like I said, I'm going to keep the chat box open. And so please, like I said, feel free to put questions in there at any time you would like. And we will take things as they come. So today I am going to be talking about quite a few different things. I'm going to be talking about CBME, assessment, and data, and really how it is that you can put all of it together for really program and learner improvement. I know I've titled this for program improvement, but it's really for both. And I think that over the years, we've really sort of focused on the learner improvement side of this, but we haven't focused on how it is that we can use these milestones, really how to help our programs. You do all of this work to collect all of this data. There are actually some really great things that you can do with it. So that being said, we're going to go ahead and get started. If you had a chance to watch the video already, that is fantastic. If not, hopefully you'll get a chance to go back and watch it after today. I am going to touch on a couple of the things that I talked about in that video, but most of it really serves as a foundation to the assessment portion of today's talk. So I'm going to start out talking about CBME, competency-based medical education, and really a focus on terminology and a way to sort of frame CBME. Like I said, that little review of good assessment, and I'm going to add another piece to it. We're going to talk about the secrets, the super duper secret tool that some of you may or may not know about. I'm going to talk about how to use your milestones data, and then I'm sure we're going to have plenty of time for Q&A. It seems like when we're virtual, things just go faster for some reason. So let's keep going. So CBME terminology. If I was there, the first thing I would ask you is, by a show of hands, how many of you feel comfortable with CBME terminology? But because I can't see you, we're just going to keep going. So what is competency-based medical education? There are a lot of different ways to describe what competency-based medical education is. This particular definition is one that I like. Now, to take a step back, competency-based education has actually been around since the early 70s. Frankly, it's probably been around a lot longer than that. We just didn't call it competency-based education. But in the 70s, there were a lot of different professions that made this move to competency-based education. And in competency-based education, what we're really looking at is the outcome, right? We're focusing on the outcome and how it is that somebody gets there and whether they get there. For competency-based medical education, we're really thinking about the societal and patient needs, right? That is the really important piece. And in our Western medical education sort of thinking, we're de-emphasizing the issue of time, right? You know, we've had what many people call the tea bag method of medical education, right? You know, you let it steep for 3 to 5 years and then, you know, you're done. Hopefully you've gotten enough competence during those 3 to 5 years, and then you can go out and start taking care of patients. And yet we know that not everybody is ready in 3 to 5 years. I want us to take a breather, though, when we think about that time element. Time becomes a resource. It is not a requirement, right? Don't think of time-based training as something that has to go away in competency-based medical education. That is usually the first fear that most people have, is that, oh my gosh, my 5-year surgery program, what am I going to do if people graduate in 4 years? Or my internal medicine program or family medicine, what if they're done in 2.5 years? No, don't take that off the table. If we are realistic in our current state of our healthcare system would be very difficult to change enough for this to happen. For us to move to a time-based system would require a lot of changes that most of our systems would not be able to manage. And so we're going to forget about the time-based element today. We're going to just talk about what the elements of competency-based medical education are and how we can start moving towards it without having to be worried about that piece that is a resource. Now, this is a comparison, I guess you could say, of two different definitions. Remember, I said that competency-based education has been around since the 70s. Well, there was actually somebody thinking about competency-based medical education in the 70s. So Bill McGahey and Lipson Lorette were two people who were thinking about it back in 1978. They published a WHO white paper. And which is really fascinating because it was 20 years later before the 6 core competencies even came to exist within medical education. Prior to that, there were no 6 areas of medical education. We did not have those 6 core competencies. We may have had areas of competence, but we did not have 6 core competencies that we looked at across all of medical education. To be more specific, across graduate medical education and postgraduate medical education. The bottom definition that you see on the screen is actually the one that was designed for the teachers, which again, like I said, they took a very early start to it. But this definition they came up to in 1995. But I like that they broke down the idea that it's really teacher-centered versus learner-centered, and progression of time versus mastery of knowledge, right? And that mastery of knowledge is what we're really going for when we think about CBME. Now, I'm going to cover some terms. I'm going to go through this rather quickly because I think that sometimes there's confusion between what different terms mean. Now, competencies, hopefully you know, we have 6 core competencies that we work with. These are specific knowledge, skills, and behavior. Everything in your program requirements are wrapped around these 6 core competencies. Your milestones are wrapped around these 6 core competencies. And then, of course, we have milestones, my personal favorite topic. And these milestones are, again, they're organized by the 6 core competencies with sub-competencies and then individual milestones. You're looking at the developmental trajectory of learners from the time that they enter your program until the time that they leave your program, right? Keeping in mind that they can go up and down, right? They can move forward and backwards. Development isn't only a forward movement, right? So it's not like growth. Although I'm now at an age where I am in fact shrinking, most people think of growth as only being positive. Just like in milestones, it can be negative. But then we have this other sneaky word that keeps popping into your vocabulary called entrustable professional activities. And this is where most people start scratching their head and saying, wait a minute, what are these now? So entrustable professional activities, these are units of professional practice, right? So remember, milestones are these individual activities, whereas EPAs are units of professional practice, tasks or responsibilities that a trainee can do once they've attained sufficient competence. Okay, so they have to be able to do something that encompasses all of these different competencies, right? It's more than just a single activity. And yet all 3 of these things are well related, okay? And in fact, competencies and milestones, we've already talked about how those are related. Now, EPAs and competencies, these are also related. Now, EPAs aren't an alternative for competencies, but what EPAs are is it gives you an opportunity to think about the competencies sort of unblock, thinking about several different domains together. Now, I've got some examples of this in a few slides, but I want you to think about how it is that you thinking about the broader activities that you do as a physician, right? A description of the work that you do, and that becomes the EPA, and you have different competencies that are part of it. And then EPAs and milestones are also tied together. And this happens, and this can be linked a couple of different ways. One of them is they might link through the supervisor's EPA decisions. Multiple milestones together might equal the task of the EPA, right? So the individual activities versus the task of the larger EPA sort of come together. And I'm going to show you an example of what that looks like here. And really, it's if you think about this, and I have to thank David Turner from the American Board of Pediatrics for this slide. He I appreciated it so much that I had to borrow it from him. And it really is sort of this wide angle view down to the zoom, right? So EPAs are very, very broad. Milestones are very, very small, which is, I think, sometimes why we have trouble assessing them. However, in this case, we are going to think about care of the well newborn. If you're a pediatrician, you're in family medicine, this might be one of your EPAs, right? The care of the well newborn. This is a really big activity or task rather that is done by a pediatrician. Now, under the care of the well newborn, there are in fact 3 different competencies. You have professionalism, communication, and patient care. Now we zoom in a little further, and one of the subcompetencies is making informed therapeutic and diagnostic decisions, right? Now, if you happen to be in pediatrics, this is one of the subcompetencies that they have. And this happens to be under patient care. Now, from here, you zoom in further to the individual milestones. presents clinical facts without filtering. This is a level 1. All right. So you can see how we've gone from this really high level, broad task that a pediatrician would do all the way down to this low level milestone that we can identify at a specific developmental level. Now, if you were to pick all of the different subcompetencies that are tied to this, which I think there's 7 or 8 of subcompetencies that are tied to this one task, then what happens is you could take all of those different milestone levels that this learner is at to identify a particular EPA level. Now, some people think you go up, some people think you evaluate down. There haven't been a lot of studies yet in terms of the assessment of this, other than in terms of EPAs, outside of some very specific surgical programs, we're not as good at assessing these really broad activities and tasks as we think we are. There was a recent article published in JGME that looked at people's ability to judge these EPAs, and they were off considerably. So something we still need to work on, something we still need more training on, but at least we know where we're starting from. And I think that that is a really important message for all of us. Now, that's the terminology. And we're not really going to go too much more into that terminology today, other than I want you to have that as sort of the background framework to use with your assessment methodologies, right? Because all of that together becomes necessary when you think about the core components of CBME. Now, Elaine Van Mel came up with this framework, the core components framework, and it has these 5 really important pillars, and you have to have all 5 of them. First is the outcome competencies, right? You have to know what your outcome is, and it has to be clearly defined. It cannot be vague. If it is not vague or clearly defined, or if it is vague, sorry, and if it's not clearly defined, then you're not going to be able to identify it and measure it. It has to be sequenced progressively, right? You can't have something that is developmental that is not sequenced in the right way. Something that is that you want to be progressive and yet isn't, again, you're not going to be able to measure. This next one is actually really hard. Learning experiences have to be tailored. You know, one of the requirements that we have is individualized learning plans. And quite often, we tend to think about learning plans sort of, here's the rotation you're in, here's your learning plan. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And I'm not saying this to be negative about programs. Everybody is super busy. But until we get to a place where we start doing more tailored learning plans for folks other than those who are struggling, right? Because we're really good at doing it for our learners who are struggling. But even for those who are really advanced and those who are doing just okay, they need tailored learning experiences as well. Competency-focused instruction. Hopefully this is something that's happening already. Teaching practices promote developmental acquisition, right? This is something that I think with the milestones has helped most programs to start thinking this way. And then finally, programmatic assessment. You have to have an assessment program that supports and documents this developmental acquisition. Now, again, I think the milestones and the assessment program that you develop behind it, if you have a strong one, you could already be doing this. Although all of these things have to be together, what's really interesting is that even in places internationally that have been doing CBME a long time, they're all in different places. there's actually a developmental chart that you can use when you think about these five different pieces, and they can we ask people to these different medical education groups to identify sort of where they were. Now, even some of the most advanced places felt that there were areas of these five that they were not as good at. They felt that they may have been really good on the competency focused instruction, but they still weren't great maybe at the tailored learning experiences or the programmatic assessment. In fact, I think those are the two that people struggle with the most. And so it's really interesting that even internationally, and there's a group called ICBE, and that's an international collaboration for competency-based medical education. They publish a lot of these papers. And so I would encourage you, if you're interested in CBME, that would be a group to look up. They actually have a meeting this summer that's going to be in Basel, right before the ACGME meeting. And they look at what folks are doing around the world related specifically to competency-based education. Now, again, we already have CBME in action, right? We've taken our first steps toward it, whether we realized we were doing it or not. And first of all, we have milestones, right? So our assessments need to be formative and frequent. So we have the milestones and we're assessing. Formative and frequent, we have to evaluate. Direct observation is something that we need to do as part of the assessment. More training is needed, and it has to be done frequently. One of the questions I often ask when I give this talk is, when was the last time that you observed a senior resident taking a history and physical? It's not something that we do very often, and yet you don't know what bad habits they may have developed over the last couple of years. You know, quite often we evaluate history and physical taking maybe 3, 4, 5 times, unless there's a problem. Other than that, we end up having senior residents do the observations and step in. But again, we know from research that direct observation actually needs a lot of training. And so it's something that we need to keep working on, and we need to keep doing more frequently, and we need to do it in multiple settings. Now, multiple assessments by multiple assessors in multiple settings. I always call this my mamas, because it's an easy way to remember it. Because one of the things we have to make sure of is that when we're assessing our learners, that we're assessing them in every setting that they're in, and it can't just be 1 or 2 assessors. There are always 1 or 2 faculty who are really, really good at doing assessment. They get them in on time, they'll do them frequently, they'll give really good feedback, which is the next one. But then you have a bunch of others who are maybe not so good at it. And so we want to make sure that we're moving forward with our faculty to encourage them to give more assessment, to do more assessment. And I heard somebody talk about this the other day, and I thought that this was such a great way to explain it. It's almost like we have to desensitize the faculty from doing assessment, so that they stop feeling like it's a chore and it's just something that's a regular part of every day. And I just thought that was such a great way to think about it. Right now, it just feels like this overwhelming burden. And yet, if we can make it simple enough, something that we do more frequently, it doesn't feel like such a burden. And when it has to be a negative review, a negative assessment, something where the learner maybe needs some work, again, it helps that faculty member get a little more used to giving that feedback if they have to do it more often. So again, feedback has to be given and received with a growth mindset. And that can be a struggle right there. If you have learners who don't have a growth mindset, that can be a challenge. And that's a whole other lecture. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on that one. And then finally, thoughtful educational opportunities, those individualized learning plans that look for learner growth and development. Now, all of this flows right into the milestones. And I always review I always like to review the milestone levels one at a time. The reason I like to do this is because I always find that there is confusion about what the milestones actually mean. Now, level 1 is the novice. Your novice, and by the way, these examples are all using clinical reasoning, right? So, and clinical reasoning, I like to use that as the example because it works for any of the competencies, right? You can find examples for any of the competencies using clinical reasoning. Now, the novice is very rule driven. Stand here, don't touch that, right? Do this. Being a novice does not usually last very long, right? This is something that most of your learners are going to be in for a very short period of time. July is coming up. You're about to have a lot of novice learners again, and that's okay. That's good. That's where they're supposed to be. Level 2 is the advanced beginner. Now, the advanced beginner, they can start doing some things on their own. You're going to send them in to do a history and physical. You're going to go in behind them and do it again, but you trust them enough to go in there and at least attempt it and report back out to you what they found. This is an area where what you're going to find is that some of your new learners, some of your brand new interns may already be an advanced beginner. They may come in and have learned enough and had good enough experience during their clerkship that they come in and they're doing a decent job at this. All right. And so they may skip over that novice piece really, really fast and become an advanced beginner after the first week. Others, it may take longer for them to get to advanced beginner. Some, it may take 6 months. It's all dependent on where they are as individuals. Level 3 is competent. Competent, this is really where they start to be able to take care of those patients who have the most common presentations of the most common disease states that you care for, right? They are performing common procedures. They're basically able to do all those routine things without you, right? They report back to you at the end of the day, or at the next time they see you, when they're doing handovers. They can operate on their own, and not operate, but they can run a clinic on their own. And again, you're still supervising, but you didn't have to be with them. However, what's really happening at this point that is really exhausting for them is they start doing this dual process reasoning. And I always think of this kind of like the Kahneman book, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow. This idea that you have front of mind, back of mind. Essentially, what happens is that they make a decision in the moment, but then later in the day, all of a sudden they're thinking through everything that they did, all the diagnoses they made, and they start thinking, oh, I had 6 patients present all in a row. They had similar, presentations, similar physical findings. And I said all of them probably had the flu. And so, I sent it off for a flu check. And now I'm thinking that, number 5 was actually a little bit different. And maybe I need to go back and do something different on that particular patient. And that means that they're able to self-regulate enough that they know when they may have made an error. And that is really, really important, especially when it's something that is of that sort of caliber. And I'm not talking about these big errors. I'm talking about things that are easily caught, easily corrected, but things that are more reasoning errors. Level 4 is proficient. Now, this is the most exciting time. They are ready to go out on their own after they hit level 4. This is when they can take care of those complex patients, presentations. They can perform complex procedures. They can really start doing it all. The funny thing here is that this is when they start to realize what they don't know. And this is where they start to understand that, oh, well, this is the patient I really need to send out for, a referral. I can't do this one. This one is above what my level of abilities are. And they're able to do make these decisions, and they understand that there's ambiguity with them. They understand that, again, there may not be an answer. This goal for graduation is really important, but it's also not a requirement. The reason that we say it's not a requirement is that we would rather that you as programs, your CCCs, don't feel pressured to mark all of your graduates at a level 4 at graduation, which we can see the programs that do it. When we do our research, we see programs that are consistent in that, where all of their residents, regardless of the amount of variability in the milestone reports throughout the years, when they graduate, everybody has a level 4. We know that that's not likely. We know that that is probably the CCC or the program director feels some sort of pressure to raise them up to level 4. But in our thinking, we would much rather that your graduates know where they're not a level 4, that they have something in front of them that says, hey, you know what, you're only a level 3. And when you go into practice, you're still graduating. When you go into practice, you still need mentorship in this area. We don't want you doing, working with complex patients in this particular area. Maybe it's a part of the specialty that they're not going to work in. So for example, pathology, right? You have somebody who is graduating within anatomical and clinical pathology, but they're never planning to work in clinical pathology. And it's the clinical pathology that they only got to level 3. That's probably not an issue for that graduate, but it's still important for them to know, just in case they do end up getting assigned to a clinical laboratory in whatever job they take. Now, level 5 is expert. Now, with this, we're talking about the expert resident or the expert fellow. In this part, this is 1 out of every 8, 1 out of every 10 who are able to actually achieve this. All right. So this is not something that is that anybody should achieve a lot of. This is a piece where they're going to be getting bits and pieces. Somebody might be able to achieve 3 or 4, unless you have somebody who is truly amazing, because most of the time it takes some real deliberate practice in order to get to that level 5. Some folks who I've seen who I think have legitimately gotten to a place of level 5 on a lot of the patient care and medical knowledge, what they end up doing is those are folks who they were practicing physicians in other countries, and they had to come and they had to go through a whole other residency. So basically they were practicing physicians and they're doing a second residency. And so at that point, they've already been sort of practicing for 8 or 10 years. And so, yes, they do in fact get higher. Now, if you have a graduate who is getting a level 3, sometimes what happens is they might feel like it's a negative, right? Like that you're being unnecessarily cruel, right? That you're retaliating against them for some reason. A lot of this takes a lot of reasons, and I'm actually going to take a step back. So let's go back to that idea of the growth mindset. And this is something that I recommend you start talking to your learners about day 1. right? Start talking to your learners day one about a growth mindset, which is really this idea of, you know, you have to, sometimes you fail to learn, right? Learning to fail, failing to learn are the opposite sides of it, because you have to embrace change. You have to embrace the fact that you're not an expert. You're still growing. You're still learning. And sometimes when you get, depending on the medical school they may have gone to, if they were at a very competitive medical school, especially, they may come in and they're still in that very competitive mindset and thinking, hey, I get a 5 for everything, right? I should, if you don't give me a 5, then you're wrong, right? You're wrong. I didn't do anything wrong. You're wrong. You want to set the stage early on so that the learners understand that this narrative that you're going to show them is what you are measuring them against. And it is the culmination of all of the different assessment tools that you're going to use to make the assessment, to make the CCC works together to create that evaluation. Sometimes the interns take a little bit of time. That first 6 months can be really difficult for some of them to understand that, you know what, getting a 2 is really good at the end of 6 months. That's not a bad thing. But again, teaching them from the beginning, I think, is really important. If you have a graduate that is leaving with a level 3, again, we're talking about a graduate, so this is not somebody that you're holding back from graduating. Again, I think it becomes more of the conversation about why they're at a level 3. What did they demonstrate or not demonstrate that would have put them at a level 4? The great thing about the milestones is that these are a learning assessment, meaning that these are not, this isn't like a licensing exam. This isn't the type of thing that can be, that somebody is going to look at later on down the line for a job, right? They're not looking at this for a fellowship. They're not looking at this for any other reason. The milestones are meant to be formative, which again, I think is really important to get your residents to understand, is this idea of formative assessment. It's assessment for learning. And if you have a graduate who can't accept that they've gotten a 3, there's probably some other issues that you may have missed along the way. And if they're going to have a really hard time with it, I'm going to guess there may have been some communication issues and some professionalism issues as well. Most of the time, that's what I hear. And so again, start teaching them that language day one, and start really thinking about how it is that you're assessing professionalism, communication. Those are 2 areas that we know are really important. Now, I don't have those areas specifically as part of my talk today, but maybe that'll be my reason to actually finally make it to Tulsa. That'll be my next talk. So again, I'm going to encourage you to be really, really open with your learners about the language of the milestones. Share the milestones with them. Share your supplemental guide with them. Be transparent in what you're assessing and how you're assessing. Have your faculty be really transparent in what they're assessing, how they're assessing, and with their feedback. I could talk for hours about really good feedback. I'll talk about it a little bit as we go through the next section, because I do think that if you have really good feedback, you can sometimes resolve some issues before they arise with some learners. But again, part of it is the issue of learners who have poor communication or poor professionalism will sometimes be the ones that don't have a growth mindset, who don't understand that they don't know everything and that growth takes time. Now, you also want to make sure that your faculty and your learners remember that it doesn't matter what level they are, that has nothing to do with their PGY. or I mean, sorry, it has nothing to do with their level of milestones. They can be a PGY3 and still be a level 2. They can be a PGY2 and be a level 4 on some subcompetencies. If their knowledge, skills, attitudes, and abilities demonstrate what is written on the paper in terms of the milestones, that's what you're measuring, right? You're not checking off, oh, you know what? We never mark any of our PG2s higher than a level 3, right? That is not what the milestones are designed for. The milestones are designed to be formative, which means that these are helping you to help your learners not only understand where they are and where they're going, but these can also help you with those individualized learning plans. So remember that one of the 2 areas that I told you everybody struggles with, this is one way that you can help improve all of that. Because in the end, it's all about the narrative and not the numbers, right? We don't want you to focus on any numbers. And I forgot to ask before if you use MedHub, New Innovations, MyEval, or whatever resident management system you use. Most of them, New Innovations, all right, most of those systems, and I know New Innovations does this, you map all of your assessment tools to the milestones, and you can run a report, and it will tell you that Dr. Smith, hopefully you don't have a Dr. Smith that's a resident, but Dr. Smith has a 3.765 on patient care 3. What does 3.765 mean? It means nothing. Because what you really want to look at when you're in your CCC is, how did the resident change over time? Did the resident get better over the 6 months, regardless of which rotation they were in? Did they stay the same? Did they get worse over time? What were the comments like? Did the comments get better, right? Did they show growth in the comments? What about any self-evaluation that you did? Looking at all of those pieces together, again, is really what you're focusing on, that you want to make sure that you've got all of it and comparing it to the narrative. And then we get back to this idea, assessment theory is great, but it really needs to be practical. My video was all about assessment theory, right? And like I said, I'm going to talk about a few little things just as a reminder, and especially for some folks who maybe didn't see it, but I am not going to be one to stand in front of everybody and say, hey, you need to know everything about assessment theory, because you don't. You need to know some basics. And I want you to be able to think about how to make assessment work for you. One of the most important things that we have to remember about assessment is cognitive load. And I say this for a lot of reasons, but in reality, there is only so much that your faculty can do, right? They work in a very complex environment. They have most of your faculty, I'm sure all of your faculty, right? They have to, is it clinical practice versus time to actually do their educational work? Plus their selective attention, right? It's like this critical patient over here, this patient whose family is calling in over here, and then you've got residents over here, and figuring out when to do it. Now, it would be interesting to see if for those of you who saw the video, how many of you knew what letters there were in the one little slide that I gave you, that I gave you a few seconds to memorize the letters. Cognitive load is a real thing, and we truly can only remember 7 plus or minus 2 things. Miller's law is real. And so that applies to everything we do in assessment. It applies to the number of days that we work on assessment, right? Some of you have probably seen the studies that say that if an assessment is not done within 7 days, it's probably inaccurate. And they've shown this over time. Because what happens is that if we go more than 7 plus or minus 2 days, what happens is we anchor on a specific event. We're not necessarily thinking about the entirety of the rotation. And so we may be thinking about one really bad thing that happened or one really good thing that happened. And that's not really giving an accurate assessment of what happened over what was a 6-week or 3-month rotation. And so having enough rotations are important. Or I'm sorry, having more recent assessment is more important. At the same time, if it's a short rotation, you can't have long assessments. There's been more and more research to show recently that short assessment tools are really valid. And not only that, but the learners really like them. It's one of the things that our Canadian colleagues have really started doing a lot of lately, is doing these frequent short assessments. They call them field notes, where essentially, and it can be done daily, it can be done weekly. They're changing the way they did it. Originally, they were asking the residents to be responsible for asking the faculty, and they've now realized that they've put all the pressure on the residents, and sometimes faculty wouldn't do it. And so now they're splitting the responsibility for it. But this idea that you have 2 people responsible for assessment, sometimes it's the resident, sometimes it's the faculty, but these in-between forms, these things that are not the end of rotation, what did they do well today or this week? What could they work on? And the whole idea with these field notes and these short types of assessments are that feedback is given to the learner immediately, right? And this goes back to what I was saying before about desensitization, because if every time you do that, you're telling somebody, hey, I need you to work on this, and here's why, you're going to get used to giving a negative feedback on something, right? And the more you do this, the more positive and negative feedback you give, the easier it's going to be for you and your faculty to keep doing it. It's going to be easier for the resident to hear. And in fact, it's usually the residents who are saying, please tell me what I can do to get better, right? Now, they might be the same ones to complain when they get negative assessments, but usually it's because they didn't know about it. They're finding out about it when they get this end of rotation assessment, and they get it 6 weeks after the assessment, the rotation ended, and there's no way for them to put it back into context. So remember, try to give that feedback a little more frequently. Another thing that was in the video talked about feasibility and utility. Now, again, this idea of theoretical versus practical, right? Because in the end, you want to make sure you're making the right decisions, right? You want to use data that's going to improve your program. But remember, in the calculation for utility and the calculation for feasibility, if any of the pieces are 0, just like in any algebra problem, if any element is 0, you're not going to have any utility or feasibility. So you want to make sure you have validity, reliability, educational impact. You want it to be accepted, which means that the faculty and the learner both have to accept that this tool is going to measure what you say it's measuring, right? And the educational impact, remember, is that it is going to do something for the learner. It's going to give the learner something to do with that result. There's nothing worse than an assessment that the learner says, okay, so now what? We need to make sure that we have something that is useful for them. And so again, we want to make sure that we're keeping in this idea of practicality while keeping the theoretical all in the back of our minds. But in the end, when we're thinking about our assessment tools, remember that the raters have to understand what is being asked. You have to do assessments in situations that the residents will actually encounter, doing behaviors that can likely be observed, right? We don't want an assessment of something that is unlikely to happen. That's a waste of utility and feasibility. They actually did create a checklist for an assessment instrument if you ever want to create your own. But the thing I want to focus on is the fact that you have to train your raters. Most often, when somebody starts as a physician in a system and they're working with residents, they say, hey, great, here's new innovations. You're gonna get a link at the end of every rotation, and you're gonna assess the residents that you worked with during that time. And thanks. Let us know if you have any questions. And that's the training they got on how to use the assessment tool. Maybe if you're doing OSCEs, they might have gotten a little more training. If you're doing some other type of simulation, maybe they got some other training. But usually we forget to train our faculty in how to do assessment. And that can be a problem. And I'm going to go into that a little bit more. But first, I also want to remind you, the milestones are a repository for all of your other assessments. We do not recommend that you use the milestones as an assessment tool. If you count how many things that they have to read on each individual subcompetency, unless there's a single row, and that's the only thing that they're actually assessing, you will break Miller's Law. You will have more than 7 plus or minus 2. All right. Plus, they really weren't designed as an assessment tool, right? They really were designed with this idea that you are going to have a lot of other pieces brought together is in order to pull it in. Not every milestone can be evaluated on every rotation, and you have a lot of other material that has to be assessed that is not included in the milestones. The milestones are not all inclusive. If they were, you would have hundreds of hundreds of subcompetencies to assess every 6 months, which means you would have people that all they did was assess competencies and subcompetencies for your learners. Every week you would have meetings, and this is all you would do year round. And so be careful with how you're using the milestones. And again, we really do not recommend using the milestones as an assessment tool. Now, how can you use the assessment tool? How can you use the milestones in your program? To become more effective, what we recommend is creating a shared mental model. This is really critical in your program. To be a truly effective program, you need a shared mental model of assessments, curriculum, how you're going to do feedback. You need it really across the board. When you have a good shared mental model, not only are you more effective, but you actually save time in other activities. When you start working on this, it takes time to create a shared mental model. So I have to put that out there. The first step takes time, but you save time later on, especially in your CCCs. If everybody in your CCC understands what it means to look at a milestone and they understand what it looks like in your program, and everybody sees it the same way, those decisions are easy to make, right? It's going to be easy to go through and do that assessment, and you can spend more time thinking about what might be next for that individual learner. And these are the reasons why, right? Do you sometimes have a faculty who take an assessment tool and they're actually measuring 2 different things, right? When you talk to them. Have your tools been mapped to your goals? Do they agree on how to measure each assessment, right? These are some really basic concepts that when I've worked with faculty, I've often found that this is very different. Have you ever had 2 faculty evaluate the same resident at the same time and they came up with 2 very different answers? It happens. And that's very confusing for the learner. You know, we think we go back, and when I first started training residents back in the early 90s, this was how these residents were usually assessed, right? Does not meet expectations, and exceeds expectations. Well, most people were somewhere between 7 and 8. If you got a 6, you were like, wait, well, oh, they just must not have liked me, right? I didn't, it was them, not me. Because everybody got a 7 or an 8. Once in a while, if somebody was really bad, they might have gotten a 5, right? But nobody really knew what the expectations were, because this was the evaluation for 3 months. So what did I meet the expectations of, right? And so what you can do is you can work together and take whatever type of assessment you're using and create some sort of shared mental model, right? I happen to give you an example that has 5, but it can have 3, it can have 7, it can have 10, it can have however many different levels that you want. But anytime you use a narrative, it's going to make it better automatically. As soon as you label what each of those numbers mean, it's basically a code. Remember, that's what rating scales are. Rating scales are a code. And so we want to decode the rating scale by using narratives. And then finally, the new piece for assessment that I wanted to add in here is this idea of the 6 W's of assessment. And this is such a handy little article and such a handy little table. So basically, it's why should the assessment be used, right? So sitting around and coming to agreement on why are we using this assessment tool? Who should be using it, right? Who should be performing the assessment? Right? You know, if it's something that's supposed to be for an inpatient assessment, you don't want your outpatient faculty using it, right? Or if it's supposed to be an outpatient, you don't want your inpatient faculty using it. What is the content or focus of the assessment, right? Is it knowledge-based? Is it skills? Is it behavioral? How will the assessment be conducted and completed? Don't forget to include, how is the training going to be done? When and how often should an assessment tool be used? And then finally, where should the assessment be applied? All right. So again, you know, it just takes everything we need to know about our assessment tools, everything we need to think about, and kind of breaks it down to these 6 easy questions. And that is going to bring us, oh, I forgot a slide. Rules for future assessment. So you want to remember that anytime you're thinking about your future things, remember to think about the purpose, providing meaning to the faculty, the learner, and your CCC, and that it assesses the 6 core competencies. So your small group activity is going to be, you're going to take the assessment tool that you brought with you, or that you have with you. I know we have lots of people on Zoom, but in your faculty groups, identify the 6 W's of your tool. All right. Which of those have you done? Can you identify which of the 6 W's are missing, right? Which ones have you not stated very clearly? What can be improved, right? What of those, or maybe you're not quite as clear as you want to be? And then finally, what faculty training approaches have you tried, right? So if you've not done a lot of faculty training on it, or if you've done some, what have you tried? Try to make a list of what you've tried doing. We're going to have you do that for about 10 minutes, and I'm going to put the 6 W's back up again. So for about 10 minutes, we're going to have you work on that in your groups. And I know we've got a few people walking around in the room. If somebody needs to come on and we need to go into a breakout, let me know. I'm happy to do that, or put a question in the chat.
So 10 minutes to talk about kind of the assessment that you guys might identify in your respective programs, and then 5 minutes for a break to get up and walk around. And so we'll reconvene at about 14:15. Fair? Okay. How's it going?
And then it's general.
But that's like
What did they want? Right. So
we all have some.
She will be back. That's, I think, the lesson I think.
Be back.
And we have to read through this, like, the rest of our files.
They don't really.
Internal disruption for ethics and internet. All clear, internal disruption for ethics and internet.
Great show.
I think it's probably similar we were at. Other parts cut out.
You know.
And it wasn't giving us any good information. So we cut out. Well.
Scroll down, so you're taking all these. I mean, after the meeting, okay. After boom, it was all up on the screen. One through.
Yeah.
They can go. I didn't find out, this is where they. To their credit, they actually, I'm not big on this. You know, my heart is. I said, I want to show them some free. It's really goes. I'm happy. I'll say it. Now, I advise last year, said. So, that's good, but I mean, this end. So.
Just tell you this. So I felt it today. And it's one of the demands. You know, and it doesn't have to be very final. The milestone that I think second period is I know. Actually, so that I can.
Value uniformity or how.
So, some days I wish it's wrong. Because I feel like I noticed. And in some of the broader areas.
Quite often we have to go.
I don't know. There's a way to make
Shame.
Yeah, and then it's where it's parallels and then on and on. So they would tell it again, they don't even have to sitting down. So, probably not, you know. When you lay down, like it looks like. And maybe it's a question. Yeah. Longer ago,
Fantastic.
create that. I've got one person I got, how are they? And each one of these actually went on top. They can still be really good. Right down.
You're not on Epic yet.
Not an effort, yeah.
Yeah, unfortunately, no, they're pretty siloed.
I've been involved enough in the management.
So, I don't know how that goes. We've been on it, yeah. We've been on it, we've been since our second. Our seats are changing. Now, for the grants.
Pretty good book. Heard that name.
I'm not better than that. But I will tell you, yeah, they get it like, you know, have a get it. I would consider it like
That's
They go around talking to the MPs. I had this.
very good.
And then I don't have to rely on work. I don't need resident.
Yeah, they're.
Like I know she's got busy. Okay. They were doing that.
Everything. So yeah, just kind of talking
Okay, I think we're gonna get everybody back together. Does anybody have any questions that they want to ask Dr. Huger? Her very, very good conversation. Anything specific coming out from the groups currently? Okay, I don't hear anything. Dr. Edgar, I didn't know if you'd be willing to talk about the three things before we dive back in. The
Sure.
neurology resident that you mentioned in your short presentation.
Yeah.
Halos and horns and doves and hawks.
Absolutely. So we'll do the neurology resident last, just because it's just one of those impactful stories that it still gives me chills when I think about it. So I do think it's really important to keep in mind the idea of the halos and horns. Think about the last time that you met somebody that your first instinct when you met them was, oh my gosh, I could be friends with this person. Or, oh, do I really, do I ever have to talk to them again? Sometimes we feel that way about our learners. We don't like to admit it, but sometimes we get this gut reaction to whether we like them or not. And that bleeds over into our assessments. It is a form of bias that happens that we're not even aware that happens. And that can lead to what we call halos and horns, the halo and horn effect, where basically just because you like somebody, you end up elevating their score. The horn happens for those folks that maybe you don't like as much. And again, the two people could have been doing the exact same thing, exact same way, and yet you end up scoring them differently. And so it is something to be really, really conscientious of. The hawks and doves are something that if in your CCC, you probably notice. You have those faculty members who just think everybody does a great job and everybody is marked really high. You know, if whatever your scale you're using, they're always marked at the highest possible levels because they're wonderful, they're fabulous, love them. And then you have others who, you know, they don't train doctors like they used to anymore. They're all terrible. They all need to go back and learn more and do more. And everybody gets really, really low scores. Those are hawks and doves. And these four ideas are part of the power of the Clinical Competency Committee. Your CCC can help mediate all of that. Number one, as part of the CCC, hawks and doves, because you're seeing their evaluations over all of the learners, you're going to know where that's happening. And as a CCC, you learn to adjust, right? How it is that you're using their comments, you know, the comments and the residents for that particular faculty member when you're considering a particular learner. The other thing that you're seeing is if you see the horn or the halo effect, what that can help you to do is to bring it to the attention of the program director so that the program director can work with that faculty member to try to bring about a correction. It is something that, again, it is almost always unconscious. Rarely have I ever met somebody who did it consciously. But again, sometimes it just happens. Now, the example that I used of the neurology resident, and again, this is absolutely the halo effect. The neurology resident, she was in the winter of her 4th year, and was somebody that patients loved, that the faculty loved, the nurses, I mean, everybody just thought that this neurology resident was absolutely fantastic. And they were in the CCC and they were rating her 4s, 4.5s, 5s on everything. And I was just sitting back. I've been lucky enough to do a lot of CCC research. And so this happened to be one of the early ones I was sitting in on. And there was a junior learner in the room, or a junior faculty member had just started that previous July. And so this was their first CCC meeting that they were sitting in on. And in neurology, one of their subcompetencies is lumbar puncture. Now, I think most people would agree lumbar puncture is a very important competency and an important skill for a neurology resident to gain competence in. And this faculty member very sheepishly rose his hand and said, "Hey, oh, that's funny. The new thing just automatically raised the hand on me. Love AI." Rose the hand and said, "Wait a minute. I've never actually seen them do a lumbar puncture." And as they went around and started talking about it, they realized that nobody had ever actually seen the learner do a lumbar puncture. And as they started to go through, what they found out was that she had such a great personality. All of her co-residents were doing her lumbar punctures for her, and she was actually terrible at them. Now, luckily, she was very bright and she was actually pretty skilled, but because she was so afraid to learn it at the beginning, she never bothered to learn it. And so they had to remediate her and teach her how to do this in her last 6 months of her neurology residency. And it was all because of this halo effect. And so it can be very dangerous, and you have to be really careful with that halo effect, because with the halo effect, you can graduate somebody who has not demonstrated a really important competence that you might need. And then I did get another question in the chat. We use ITE scores for MK. A pool of questions for MCQs, monthly quizzes, didactics, what medical knowledge to direct patient care, how ITE exam score. Yeah, Muniza, can you come online and can you tell me exactly what the question is? There's a lot in here.
Right, I think that might have been a comment.
Yeah, Dr. Edgar, it's Dr. Bright. I think that may have just been a comment on different tools that they use, but one of the conversations that while we try to figure that out and clarify that we had in the room was talking about different assessment tools and using tools to assess an episode. I watch a resident do X, Y, and Z, take a history, perform an exam, do a procedure. That versus end of experience evaluations. Could you do a series of daily assessments and substitute those for an end of experience evaluation? How can those come together in a formative way so that it best utilizes both faculty time and their skills and being able to evaluate something tangible versus bringing a larger assessment together of how that resident's or fellow's progressing over time?
Yeah, so yeah, I think you can. I think you should still have an end of assessment because I think there is that time that you should reflect on, but you've got all those short feedbacks that you've done. And if you've got all those short feedbacks, it's probably not going to take you a lot of time. So I think it's an and I'm not trying to give you, a ton more work. But let's say, for example, if you did, we'll go easy. Let's say once a week. I always love Feedback Friday. If once a week you did, here's what you did well, here's what you need to work on, and you put that into new innovations, you give that information to the resident. At the end of a 3-month rotation, you've got 12 of those where you can see how they've changed over those 12 weeks, right? Because maybe you were the faculty who worked with them for the full 12 weeks. Maybe you only worked with them for half of it, but you've got now everybody else's assessments as well. It's not going to be that hard to put together as a summary because you're going to be able to see how did they grow over that time. Because when you think about that summary assessment of that time, really that's kind of what you're looking at is where did they end up? Where are there still things that you have concerns with? So I do think it's still an and. I wish we could get rid of the end of, but unless I think you do a lot of those assessments, I don't think you can get rid of the end of rotation assessment.
Any last questions before we go on? All right, Dr. Egger, I think we can keep going.
All right, excellent. I love it. All right. So I am now going to talk to you about the super tool. The supplemental guide was created, actually was originally created for international programs. When we first created Milestones, we had them by region. And in the Middle East, as you might imagine, they practice differently depending on where you are. Surprising, right? And so we had this idea of creating a supplemental guide. And for Milestones 2.0, we decided to bring it to you. Now, the great thing about the super tool is that it helps to do one of the things we've already talked about, and that is creating a shared mental model. The supplemental guide is a really great tool for a lot of different things, right? So for example, and we're not actually going to do this, if I was there with you, we would, but if I were to ask all of you, what does this statement mean? Synthesizes information to make clinical decisions for straightforward conditions. All of you would have slightly different answers, right? You would all come up with slightly different things. You would come up with slightly different ways to assess it, right? The great thing with this new super secret tool that a lot of people have still not found is that we give you a way to create that shared mental model to help you make your CCC go a lot faster, make your process more transparent, and to make your learners part of the co-production of their own education. Now, I don't know how many of you have done filled out your supplemental guide yet, but the supplemental guide is available to you as both a Word and a PDF version. It is pre-filled out for you by the same group who created the original Milestones, right? So these are the examples that were identified by a particular group of people that may or may not have anything to do with the type of work that you do in your setting. Now, in this document, you have the overall intent, which is basically your goals and objectives. You have examples for each individual milestone. You have assessment models or tools, which are what's listed in here are mostly just models, and it's not super specific, but it gives you ideas of how they can be assessed. Curriculum mapping is blank, with the very rare exception where there are national curriculum. So for example, cardiology has a national curriculum and we filled it in. But otherwise, you can use this to help map your curriculum out. And I'm going to talk about why that's important in a minute. And then finally, notes and resources. The notes and resources are things that can be helpful to you as the program director, could be helpful to the CCC, could be helpful to the learner who might be either struggling or trying to figure out how to get to the next level, right? They can be used by anybody. What we recommend that you do is to go through and create examples of what these look like in your context. Here's the reason why we want you to do this, and not necessarily just say, no, we're just going to use the supplemental guide you created. So I said before that I am based the suburbs of Chicago. In the city of Chicago, we have several emergency medicine programs. 2 programs I'll talk about. One is at Northwestern Medical Center. Now, Northwestern Medical Center is in an area of town called the Gold Coast. So just by its name, it gives you a vision of what that area of town looks like, right? They get some car accident victims, but they get lots of, people jogging down Lakeshore Drive that fall over and break their ankles, some minor car accidents, heart attacks, things like this. On the other side of town, just 5 miles away, actually, it might even be less than that, is Cook County Hospital. Now, Cook County Hospital is one of the largest public hospitals in the US. Cook County Hospital takes care of the poorest residents of Cook County, which is the county that Chicago is in. It gets most of the victims of gun violence, stabbings, it gets lots of car accidents, it gets, you name it, they see it. In fact, a lot of trauma surgeons want to do their training at that hospital because of the exposure that they get in the emergency room. So these 2 emergency medicine programs, they have the same program requirements. They're going to be sitting for the same emergency medicine certification. However, the experiences that they are getting and the experiences that they will be assessed during are very different. Remember earlier, one of my slides, I said that you want your assessment to be in situations where you are normally where they can be easily observed, right? You want your examples here to be things that are going to be easily observed, things that you think that your CCC can all agree, this is what level 2 looks like in our program, right? Maybe you have an example for inpatient and outpatient if you're a primary care program, right? These examples are basically the way that your CCC comes to this common understanding and is able to keep moving forward. You're able to communicate this then with your learners so that you're able to say to your learner who comes to you and says, why was I only a level 1? I know I'm only an intern, but why was I only a level 1 and not a level 5? And you can point to the supplemental guide and say, well, these are the things you have to be doing in order to be a level 5. All right. For the assessment models and tools, one of the things I recommend is you can do a really explicit sort of a mapping of your assessment tools so that you can make sure that you are in fact getting those multiple assessments by multiple assessors in multiple settings. The curriculum mapping, I will tell you that I'm not usually as worried about this for patient care and medical knowledge. You've got that covered. You've got that covered. It's for the other 4 areas, the other 4 competencies that we often forget about. Where is it in your curriculum that you formally teach professionalism or that you formally teach communications, right? And these are things that, you know, if you have a learner who is struggling, they have the legitimate argument of saying, well, where did you teach me that that's what I'm supposed to do? Right. So you want it to be, if you can make it a formal document, if you can say, hey, this is where we went through all of this, document it, share it with the learner. It becomes a record for them to have and for them to be able to look at themselves. And again, for the resources, then use resources that you would use. These were resources from a group, and for some of these specialties, these are getting a little old. Family medicine, if I recall, was pre-pandemic. So at this point, those resources are at least 5 years old. And so you want to go through and update those particular resources. So these are things that you can do with the supplemental guide. Basically, you can go in and just delete everything on the right-hand side and start over. Or you can just go in and edit what you don't like. I can tell you that because I do this work with all of our international partners as well, and it's been amazing. The patient care and medical knowledge, some specialties stay very much the same for primary care. We see some changes to the examples. So for example, in Pakistan, they have a lot more examples with infectious disease because that is something in primary care that they see a lot more of. In obstetrics and gynecology, they use different examples in the Middle East than what they use in Singapore, right, or in Vietnam. So we want to make sure that we're thinking about these examples and how they relate to you. The other 4 competencies are usually where internationally we see big differences. And so again, think about how it applies to you. But here's the really cool thing. This document can do so much more for you. Remember when I told you about mapping your curriculum and your assessment? Well, actually, Mo sent this to me, so thank you. I decided to use it. Here's one way of mapping your milestones across over to your different rotations by year, right? So you're able to go through and see where everything is. This becomes a really easy way to look for gaps, right? If there's something missing, something that you don't need, or I'm sorry, something that you need, but it is missing, you're going to be able to fill it in. It's going to make it a really clear image of it. And I give you an example as well for assessments. You know, if you go through and do your assessments, you can list your assessments across the top, and then you can list your milestones across the side and just mark which ones you're doing for what. This is going to help you to realize whether you've got a gap in your assessment program, or if you need to redo something, if you need to rethink some of your assessments. Because remember, one of the things I said in the video was that sometimes we think we have to throw out our assessment system and start over. And usually all we have to do is make tweaks to it. We don't usually have to, you know, we don't have to start all over. Sometimes we just make some little changes to it. So see where you are, create something like this, and then you can move forward. All right. Now I did the little circle there over the weekly ones, because one of the things you can do with those weekly assessments that I talked about is you can actually set it up so that each week it's looking at a different sub-competency. So a really great way to fill in your assessments for some of these sub-competencies that are maybe a little more difficult to assess. So, and you can let people know and say, hey, you know, these are the assessments by week. Here are the topics. And again, we're not going to give them the milestone itself, but we're going to give them the overall subcompetency or something related to it to say, again, what did they do really well related to patient and family communication? What do they need to work on related to patient and family communication? And then maybe you throw in an other, right? So if there was something else they did really, really well, or did really, really need some consideration for other interventions, that can be included as an other comment. But there are lots of ways that you can think about how to organize your assessment so that you can make sure that you're getting all of it. But by mapping, using that supplemental guide becomes a first step to helping you get there. Some of the other ways that you can do it are you can use the milestones to create your own individualized learning plans, curriculum planning, assessment maps, your program evaluation, and then even clinician educator milestones, right? So if you haven't heard about those, that's another new great thing. We have clinician educator milestones for professional development. So here's an example using one of those clinician educator ones in the learning plan. So this particular subcompetency was curriculum building. And you can see the milestones over here on the left. And in this case, this would have been somebody who had identified that they achieved a 1. All right. And then you can list in the examples exactly what is going to be demonstrated in order to show that a level has been achieved, right? What exactly or how exactly are you going to assess it? And what notes and resources are you going to use? Right? Just becomes a really easy way for somebody to build their own learning plan with a document that you've made available to them. Because maybe even the examples that you have in your supplemental guide, maybe it's something that is something that is commonly seen, but you might want to be more specific. If you're using this for a resident learning plan, you might want to have multiple examples in there instead of the typical 1 or 2 examples that might be included. That way they understand the breadth of what it is that you're looking for. Now, going back to curriculum planning, sometimes you have special topics that you think are really important that there's no milestone for. The supplemental guide can help with that as well. So here's an example. Other than the specialty of pain management and anesthesiology, pain management is not a subcompetency in most of our specialties. However, we can create our own that has our own plan for pain management. Now here's one. You see that we've got, we have milestones over here on the left that we just changed the language of, because this now says pain management, but originally this was actually the management plan for allergy and immunology, right? So all we did was we took the supplemental guide and we found one that we liked, and we altered the language to be for the special topic that we were interested in. And again, then you build out the examples and everything else in the same way. It's just another way to put all of these things together into a similar format as the way that you're doing the subcompetencies for milestones. For the assessment mapping, as I said, it just gives you a really good way to make sure that you are in fact assessing all 6 competencies. It gives you a really good way to make sure you've got multiple assessments across all of those competencies. And it also helps you to make sure that your tools incorporate the essence of the subcompetency. One of the things you can actually do is go back and look at your tools, and you might say something like multi-source feedback, items 7 through 11, right? So this becomes again a way to remap your multi-source feedback tool into your new innovations. For program evaluation, there's multiple components already here, right? That you know that you need as part of your program evaluation. Two of the really easy ones are the curriculum review and verification of goals and objectives, because the overall intent is pretty similar to your goals. And some of the milestones even match some of your objectives, especially if you look at the level 4s. Oh, I just said this. The other important piece with curriculum review is that remember that in competency-based education, remember that curriculum is a backwards design, right? And I think this is a really great way for you to think about all of your curriculum. The next time your program evaluation committee is meeting and thinking about any curriculum, you always want to start with the need, right? What is your community need? What is the outcome that you want to your learners to get to? Then you do this backwards part, right? So then you do your needs assessment, your educational strategies, and then how are you going to evaluate and get feedback on the curriculum you designed? The supplemental guide, like I said, can also be used for professional development. I showed you this already with the with using it as a learning plan. Those milestones have been out for a little over a year now. I'm just going to spend a minute talking about these milestones. There are a total of 20. They were designed for professional development, and they were designed for clinician educators across the continuum of medical education. I don't want anybody to think that they should be jumping in and try to be a 4 or a 5 on all 20 of them. I like to think of it as something where each faculty member can focus on 1 or 2. And if each faculty member is a 4 or a 5 on 2, and you have a group of 10 faculty member and all 10 of you have all 20 of them raised up, then you have a fantastic faculty who are able to accomplish anything. And so again, these are there for you if you're interested in using them. They're also a great way to help you think about faculty development and areas you might want to focus on. All right, so small group activity here again. And so depending on where your group is, we're going to have you do a couple of different things. If you have not yet completed your examples, one of the things that we would like you to do is sit with your group. We're going to have you work on systems-based practice. Start creating examples. You can review the examples that are there, edit what doesn't work for you. Map the milestones to your curriculum. Where do you teach these systems-based practice topics? Really think about that. And then map your assessment tools to the milestones, being as specific as possible. Now, hopefully you've already got that first one done. You've got your examples done. But like I said, if not, start with the examples and then go to the other 2. So we are going to come back at 2:55. So spend 10 minutes doing this work, and then we're going to come back together.
Yes.
Yeah, we have some more working for us. I think that was Like, so I go through all the red lights, so we're talking. Yeah.
You got.
You guys do the same way. We want some. One. You can be like a day on lot. And then find ourselves going like. Doing everything like. It's these other two are same milestone and they kind of all the same. And so we'd be going back. So I think it's saving us a lot of time and like. And so it's really go all the way through 1 mile and having to be. Not great. Okay, you guys have the same.
So maybe.
Right. So we talked about. That makes me feel better. Oh,
Yeah. I mean.
Yeah, so yeah.
It is. Very, I mean, during the most of the meetings. How many things? Like, yeah, so never.
Yes, they will get the audit back in. But if they're another matter. This is right. People are getting that. They have all the Any questions for Dr. Edgar?
Yes.
That they have to do. Some of the faculty are having difficulty finding the Word document. Is that in a different location than the PDF document?
It should be in the same place. Hold on, let me double
I think
check.
it was family medicine, correct? That was having the biggest issues finding the Word document. Does that sound about right? Okay.
So it's called the template. So if they click, I see it right here. So if they click on the Family Medicine Supplemental Guide template, that's the Word document.
Okay. Did you guys get that? If you go to the template for Family Medicine Supplemental Guide, that should get you to a editable document. Any other questions? Dr. Ty,
Mike, okay,
I'll repeat you too.
okay, where does Dr. Edgar suggest we find places to teach about the healthcare system in our curriculum? Like what resource would help
About the healthcare system.
system-based practice?
Did you catch that?
I did. So here's another super secret for you. All of you share content in this area. There are a set of harmonized milestones across all specialties, which means that you can work together to create. So that's the first piece. In terms of systems-based practice, so depending on your specialty, the numbers might be different, but patient or SBP 1 is usually quality, patient safety and quality improvement. Quality improvement is oftentimes taught either through, maybe you're doing an IHI set of didactics, or maybe you have a quality person at your institution who's teaching it. So that's typically how that one is formally taught. The patient safety is often, that's usually taught to them at the very beginning, as soon as they enter the program, like in the first couple of weeks, right? There's usually a lot of direct patient safety information taught. However, if they're not doing things like patient safety analysis, that might be something that you have to add in. Again, depends on how your program is set up. You might be able to do that as an institutional level didactic, training, instead of just in the individual programs. The part 2, SBP 2, coordination and transitions of care, that you probably need to do in your individual specialties, only because you're each going to have different types of handoffs and different types of transitions. And so with that, there are some really great websites. And I believe that there are some books that you could use as well. That may only be a single didactic. You may not have to do much more than that. And I think that's true for a lot of these topics. They spend more time on it when they're in medical school. So what you're doing is really the application piece of it. The third one, which is the one everybody struggles with, which is the health system science. One of the things that I sometimes recommend doing is you could bring somebody from billing and coding to come down and talk to your faculty about what your system sees. Somebody from your finance office to come and talk about what insurance is and what the impact of insurance is in their program. One of the things that we know is that that's a big learning curve when they get out into practice, and they're going to have to learn all of that, whatever system they work in. And if they don't understand how insurance or lack of insurance impacts what they're doing, they could make a lot of mistakes that hurt patients in ways that they don't even realize that they're doing it. And so we want them to learn this while they're with you. So those are a couple of ways that you could teach that to them. Otherwise, there are also some really great health system science books out there. For that, you want somebody in your system who knows a lot about health system science. But like I said, I think some of the easier ways are somebody from billing and coding and somebody from your finance office are usually really good ways to have them come down and help you. I know one program where they have their residents, they take a cohort of their patients and they go and they sit with somebody from the billing office so that they can understand the bills that have been created for each of their patients. They go through and they see what insurance covered, what it didn't cover, how much the patient had to pay, what other options might have been that they could have chosen otherwise. So I think that there are some different things that you can do to help them learn about those things. So those are a few things. Hopefully that helps.
Yes, I'm getting a lot of nods. Any other questions before she goes into the next phase? Okay.
All right.
Questions. Okay.
So hopefully you found that exercise helpful. Family medicine probably didn't, since you were struggling with finding the document. But the good news is that take your time with filling out this document. If you've not done this work yet, you don't have to do it all at once. And that's the other piece. I don't want you to feel like you have to spend like an all-day retreat filling out the supplemental guide. What you can do is if you have let's say you have a monthly meeting where you're all together for, maybe it's just a regular department meeting, take 10 minutes of each meeting or 15 minutes of each meeting dedicated to trying to create the shared mental model. If you can't do that, try and get your CCC together for just 15 minutes a week to try to do this. Think of it as a CCC huddle, right? Getting together to create a shared mental model about one subcompetency at a time. So you don't have to do all of it all at once. You can find ways to do this over time in bite-sized pieces. But again, there is so much value in doing it, which is one of the reasons why I keep pushing it. So with that, we're going to go on to the next part, which is you've collected all this data, you've submitted your milestones, which, by the way, I always like to remind everybody, your review committee does not see your data. The only people that see your milestones data is my department and our data department. Outside of that, your review committee only knows that you've submitted your complete set of milestones or you have not submitted your complete set of milestones. They do not review it to give you citations based on the evaluations that you've given. So please keep that in mind. Now, each fall, 2 reports are made available. One of them is the Milestones National Report, and then also what we call the PPV report. Now, the Milestones National Report is a series of box plots of national data, and the PPV report is really having you look at probability tables that show you the probability of a learner not getting to level 4. So it's kind of a fun table to look at. Helps you decide whether or not a learner needs an intervention. Now, some of this data is actually available in ADS, right? So your box plots, maybe you've looked at it, maybe you haven't, but some of it is available in ADS. So what we have here, and this is just for those of you who aren't familiar with box plots, I always like to show this. This is just a way to think about how to read it. You know, the mean is in fact the diamond, the median is the line in the middle of the blue box. The top and the bottom of the box are the 25th and 75th percentiles. The whiskers, if you will, the ends of the whiskers are your min and max, which are essentially your 5th and 95th percentile. And then you've got your outliers. Now, sometimes, like if you look at the resident year 4, sometimes you get straight lines. You know, sometimes everybody gets the same score, and we're still trying to figure out how that happens. But that's okay. This is why we continue to update and try to improve the milestones work as well. So this is what the milestones or the box plots look like. Now, this is actual data. I just took a screenshot of family medicine. And so what these box plots include are, first of all, how many residents are in each year. They give you that data that we just reviewed, and then they tell you how many residents had a score of not yet accessible. Now, remember, most specialties have the option of not yet accessible or not applicable, or some other language like that, along with not yet reached level 1 or critical, or some other more negative language. The difference being that not yet accessible means that they either haven't rotated in it or you did not yet receive enough evaluations in order to give them a milestone score. So as you can see, as we look at these 2 tables, you see across both patient care 1 and patient care 2, you see that there is a nice growth from year 1 to year 2 to year 3, you know, with the mean and the median going up in each of them. You can also see that we have a nice spread for the year one for the mins and the maxes. I will say I would be really surprised to see a PG1 at a level 4 for care of patients with acute or chronic illness. But again, that's at that 95th percentile. So we probably have some programs nationally that are scoring really high. You know, they're the hawk or they're the doves, right? And then as we're going across, we see that in other, like in the year 2, we can see that our mean, our median, and our 25th percentile are all the same, right? So that's what that means when the diamond is there at the bottom. That means that all of that is the same score. So most of our learners are right at that score. And then, of course, in patient care 2, you can see that in level 4 for our year 3 folks, almost everybody has a level 4 at that particular point in time. All right, so that's how you can read this. Now, one of the things that you can do is compare your data to this. And I've got a whole set of slides that we're going to talk about how to compare your data with the national data. But first, I want to show you how to read this data. One of the things that we committed to when we first developed the milestones was figuring out how to show you the data in a way that was going to be helpful to you. Now, I don't think this graph would have been helpful to anybody, but what this is these are the different trajectories of a cohort of emergency medicine residents that started in July of 2013 and graduated in June of 2016. Now, everybody in yellow never made it to level 4, and everybody in blue did. And so what we wanted to do was we wanted to figure out what was the risk of that particular learner at that point in time of not getting to level 4. Now, I don't know how clear the screen is where you are, but there are actually several blue lines that are also crossing through that point, right? So that doesn't mean that everybody at that point is not going to get to level 4. So we need to make sure that we're really thinking about how does this happen? So we have an expert statistician that works for us. And so he came up with this idea of a PPV matrix, which is the opposite of most predictive probability tables, because usually you're predicting the probability that something will happen. In our case, we're predicting the probability that something will not happen. In this case, if you have somebody that is at the end of year 2 and has a level 3 on a particular milestone, there's a 24.7% chance that they will not get to level 4. Now, you might look at that and say, hey, that's actually not bad. They have a whole year. We're not too worried about it, right? Now, if they were half a score lower, if they were only at 2.5, they would be at 51.5% chance of not getting to level 4. And at that point, you might be more concerned. It does not mean that they need to be in remediation, but it might mean that you need to do some sort of intervention. It might mean a learning plan. It might mean some extra rotation in something instead of an elective. It could be a lot of different things. And again, it all depends on the subcompetency and what the other milestones and subcompetencies look like. Are you seeing similar probabilities across everything? Or is this a one-off? Is this the first time that they've had a high risk of not achieving a level 4? Or is it the first time? Right? There's a lot of things that you can ask when you look at this data. And so here's another one. What's great about these charts is that they are color coded using oranges and yellows. And so the darker it is, the more at risk they are. So here's one where there's a 44.5% risk, but they're mid-year in year 2. So again, you have to ask the question. And then here's another one at year 4 in surgery at the end of year 4, where they're at a level 3 and they're again at a 40.4% chance of not getting to level 4 on patient care 1. They have to decide again what that risk means in their program. Depending on how much of a hawk or a dove or a midliner your program scores, it may change how you view this particular PPV value. So now that you understand how to read the 2 charts, I want to talk to you about how you can use the data and these charts for program improvement. Because again, you've got this data, you might as well use it. What you really want to spend your time doing is really thinking about understanding the scope of your own data, right? Understanding what you have, because it can drive program improvement and frankly, even evolution. It can help you suggest areas of program focus. If you've got some trends in areas, or you see a shift in the scores in a particular area, maybe you have some program bias going on, and maybe whether it's a particular faculty member or it's a program overall. These are all things that your Milestones data can help you to identify. Now, I mentioned before, but besides the reports, ADS provides you data for your learner, for your program, and national data, right? So you can see all of this data in ADS. You don't have to wait for this report to be printed. Now, the report sometimes contains other information, contains other details. For example, it has a report on what we call straight lining. So the number of programs where all the residents at a particular level all get the same score. My PG3s should all be 3s, or my PG2s should all be 3s, and everybody gets the same score. We do calculate other things in the report besides just the box plots. But you can see this data in ADS at any time. So here's an example. This is actually from OBGYN, and this is what 2 different individuals might look like, right? So this is individual 1 and individual 2. You can pull up and compare what the 2 different people look like. You could compare what their different things review. What I want to point out, this one on the right, you notice that this person in this particular patient care subcompetency, they actually went down a level midway through their training. Now, that can happen again for a lot of different reasons, but it's important to note. You can look at really important trends again, comparing your program data to the national data. I realize the boxes themselves aren't lined up, but I wanted to actually line up the level 5 and the level 4. So I know at my first glance, this slide looks a little funky, but it's because I wanted to line up the level 1 and the level 1 going across to help make it a little bit easier. And so what you can see is I am going to use the resident year 4 on this one. You can see that in this particular program for quality improvement, this is a much wider 25th and 75th percentile, whereas the national data shows a flat straight line, right? For the 25th, 50th, and 75th percentile, everybody's at 4. But within this program, they really range between a 4 and a 4.5, right? And so it's an interesting thing to mark, right? That this program has more spread. The other thing that you might note is that in the first year residents, their residents are mostly at a 1.5. Well, nationally, most of the residents are at a 2. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, let's think about that. When you see something like that pattern, just ask why, right? Do we need to do more assessment? Do we need to clarify some of our data? Do we need to, do we need to look back at other patterns as well? Do we need to, go back multiple years and see what's been happening on this? Or is this the expected pattern that you've been seeing over and over and over again? And this is just the natural way that your program has been working. It's the way that your program has been teaching. It's the way that your program has been progressing across all of these areas, right? This data is really designed to help your program improve. It's to help you identify, again, areas where maybe you're ahead of the game, maybe areas that you're behind. Thinking about whether you're going to have to use this data to help your learners do something different. But again, simply ask why. It doesn't mean that if your data is different, it doesn't mean that there's a problem. All right. So here's just a few tricks about how you can do this. Now, one of the things that you can do is you can look for patterns or trends in your milestones data. One DIO that I work with, she loves to use Excel, and she plots all of her data in Excel using 3D graphs. And it's fun to look at. So it's one way to do it. You can look at the variation among residents in a PG level, right? Make sure that you see variation. These are adult learners. Adult learners are not going to be learning all at the same level all of the time. There are certain experiences that they may all get at the same time, which may naturally put them at specific levels. But if you see that you've got a program where if your CCC is putting all of your learners at the same score for everything, you want to go back and talk to your CCC. You want to look at the rate of progression between your different subcompetencies. Again, you should see some variation simply because your learners are all in different rotations, right? So when you're looking at individual data and your program data overall, you should see some differences. So this is an example of that 3D chart that I was telling you about. And one of the things that you'll notice in this particular chart, and this was an example from a pediatrics program, is that the dark green is the pediatric 1, the pink is pediatric PG2, and the light green is the pediatric PG3. And what you'll see is that the means get higher as you keep going across, right? As you look into the 3D, into the deeper levels, and you can see how you've got nice growth going across each of the levels. You see variability. You don't see that everybody is getting the same score, right? So ideally, this is what most programs would look like if you were to look at a full program on a particular subcompetency. Now, some of this is going to depend on the number of residents that you have in your program. If you only have 2 residents a year, it's not going to look like this, right? So you may have to use multiple years of data in order to figure out whether or not what your trends look like as you look across years. Now, here's an example of what straight lining looks like. You can see where you've got, in the first example, all the residents in each year all get a single score. In the second example, they use 2 scores, and that's it for all of their residents. Again, assuming that there are multiple residents, not just 2. But essentially thinking about the program level trajectories and patterns, right? It can highlight these really specific issues. Poor progression across trainees in specific areas, right? So it's going to cause your program to think about curriculum, thinking about where it's assessed, and whether your method of assessment is the best one, right? So it goes back to what we said before, right? It goes back to our 6 Ws. Take it back, rewind a little bit. So taking it back to the 6 Ws. If you don't see good progression in your milestones data across your residents, across each year of your program, this is going to be something where you're going to be able to do. Think about your curriculum and then the 6 Ws of assessment. The other thing to look at is whether you have poor variation between the residents, between the levels, and poor variation in rate of progression between subcompetencies. You also want to think about straight lining. Think about your faculty rater concerns. Have your faculty said anything about concerns about doing the assessment? Are they concerned about that they didn't have enough time to do the assessment? The assessment is too difficult to use. Is there something wrong with the tool itself? Again, the 6 Ws. We're going back to that whole concept of the 6 Ws to even think about this piece. So when your program evaluation committee comes together, and again, this is all the data that your CCC has already been looking at and is already compiling. Just remember, each program is going to be different. And in fact, your program data may look a little different depending on the cohort of residents that you're working with. We all know, we've seen this, I've seen this over and over again since the pandemic, where each year our learners are looking very different. From what I understand, this next year of graduates is going to be, or I should say your next group of interns is the last group, of course, that didn't have, that had the whole COVID experience. And so this will be the last group that had part of their med school, all virtual. And so we'll see what happens after that, see if things change again. But everybody these last 4 years have seen greater variation across their learners. And so remember, that's okay. Every resident, every rotation is different. That change from the national data is completely expected. You just want to figure out whether or not it's reasonable. So here's your next small group activity. What we would like you to do is to take your last set of milestone evaluations. So if you just recently had a CCC, fantastic, use that data. We're going to use your PG2s, or you can go back to your data that you submitted last January. Want you to look at your individual learner data. For medical, we're going to use specifically medical knowledge and interpersonal and communication skills. You can pull it up through ADS, might be the easiest way to look at it, or you can download the report. And we want you to compare and see for your individual learners, your PG2s, are there any specific areas that you think you need to investigate further, right? Are there areas that you're like, oh, wow, why are we so different from the national data? And then do the same thing for your program data. Looking at your program data, do you see anything in that overall program data that you want to question, that makes you want to look at a little bit deeper? So we're going to spend 10 minutes doing this. And again, you can get this under the milestone reports, is where you should be able to find this data. And the data you're going to be comparing it to is the 2023 annual data. So it'll be the 2022, 2023. So 10 minutes. About 3:35, we'll come back and have fun.
Those two.
Yes.
No.
We're medical.
Oh, man.
This for our.
I think she did.
But then we're good.
Haven't.
What's really.
You know. Better, not elevating miles.
No, I'm sorry.
That's
That was an issue. That's cool.
Just. Let's they understand. Yes, absolutely. So that's. It's a milestone, it's very detailed, but it's focused on.
Look at it. Actually gets accurate. My problem. Yeah, she's got it right. So it's rated.
So there's something else. Because you're not paying attention. You'll have that outlier, all the others that it's going to take away something. Yeah, that's. And then you'll.
I know that they're looking at something here, it's a Family has it. Yeah, so there was this. So I guess.
That's fine. Right, no, it looks like. Figure out. Run around the sewers.
Any other questions? Any questions from the group for Dr. Edgar? I don't think there are any questions. We're kind of having a robust discussion about how the milestones are much more applicable to maybe the primary care specialties and also the surgical specialties, and how to incorporate that into their assessment overall, particularly in the supplemental guide. Any ideas on how to do that?
Yeah, so that is why I think the supplemental guide is so valuable. You're translating it to what it means for you. It might mean something slightly different in your program. One of the things that, we tried to give examples, and I don't know, I'm assuming you're talking about general surgery?
Yeah, you've got a couple general surgeons, orthopedic surgeons, got some radiology, ER, kind of all of those procedural skills, obstetrics and gynecology, about really how to tailor that to get the information that we need.
Yep.
And not make it super cumbersome.
Yeah, so first of all, so two things. The supplemental guide, I think orthopedic surgery, theirs matches what you have to do for the board. So there's a lot, that's why that document is so big, is because it has a lot of the board requirements in it. So keep that in mind when you're looking at it. For the others, they tried to be sort of, they tried to make it a document for everybody, and that never works, right? Because every location, every institution has their own patient population. So what your CCC has to do is to really think about when you read that particular, of course, now I'm trying to think of one of the subcompetencies off the top of my head. But when you're thinking about like disposition, right, for emergency medicine, you have to think about what that looks like, right? What is it that you expect your residents to do when you read that the overall intent of the subcompetency, and you read that level 4, what does it really look like for you? For the surgical specialties, I would say that using the, patient care and medical knowledge are usually a lot easier to assess. You can use, whether you use the Swish scale or you're using like the OSAT or something like that, which those are much easier tools to use because they're very specific. They're very direct. Those other areas, I think we've sort of fallen into a trap in in the other 4 competencies of, oh, well, they're just hard to do. And they are hard to do, but they're still really important. When I did the milestones with neurosurgery, they tried to argue that they didn't need any of those other competencies. And I actually had to say to them, so you don't think patient safety in neurosurgery is important? And it only took about 2 seconds before everybody was like, of course it's important. These are things that they do all the time. We just have to find where they do it. And here's a trick about where to help find it. If you have chief residents, probably not your outgoing ones. They're too close to done. Your incoming chief residents, have them help you find it. They know where they learned some of these things. They know where some of these things can be assessed. They're going to be able to point to where it was that it was done. Radiology, yes, some of these are very important, and I would be happy to have an offline conversation with your radiology folks about ways that they can find easier ways to assess some of these that are, especially that are patient-centered or patient-facing rather, subcompetencies, just because we've done this quite a bit. But for the others, it really is just finding that place, and your learners probably know where that is. Another piece is try not to project, because I've seen this as well, and I've not met you, so I'm hoping nobody does this. But I have seen where sometimes there's this projection to the learners that, we have to do this, and, they say we have to look at systems-based practice, but this is silly. I don't know why we have to do this. When you send that message to your learners that systems-based practice isn't important, you're sending the message that these topics aren't important. And yet these are the things where learners, when they go out into practice, they start getting into trouble, right? We all know patient care and medical knowledge is not where learners, or not where physicians get in trouble. It's the other areas, the other competencies. Not usually practice-based learning and improvement, not as much, but systems-based practice, professionalism, and communication. This is where physicians get in trouble. They screw up billing and coding. They do things against insurance. Those are big areas for malpractice. They're unprofessional. If you are unprofessional, there has been some studies. If you demonstrate unprofessionalism in the OR towards nurses, if you snap or show disrespect, you are more likely to be sued for malpractice. We know that communication, if you have poor communication skills, not only are you likely to lose your license in your state, but you are also likely to have patients who are less likely to do what you need them to do to take care of themselves when they leave your office. So these are really important features. In the past, we've just not spent as much emphasis on them. And so it's one of the reasons why I picked these specifically to talk about today, because these are such important areas. So there's a few places where I think you could find them. The other thing I would encourage you to do for systems-based practice, work by Jed Gonzalo. He has a lot of really great stuff on these areas, especially systems-based practice. He actually calls them the broccoli competencies, which I think is hysterical. You know, they're really good for you, but doesn't mean we like them. So you might enjoy some of his work. I will get off my pedestal now. I hope that helped. But yeah, so learners, they're gonna be able to help you out with that.
Any other questions or comments? And Dr. Edgar, was that kind of our final section?
Well, I just got just a couple of more slides, because I'm guessing at this point, this is kind of how you're all feeling. A little bit of cognitive overload, because I've given you a lot today. You know, I know sometimes we do tend to cram faculty development altogether. I'm happy to answer any other questions. But I do want to show you how to find a couple of things. When you go to the ACGME website, we have right in the middle, you can see where it says milestones. I've circled it here for you. And if you go to the resources section, we have a ton of resources for you. We have all kinds of guidebooks. We have a guidebook on assessment, milestones implementation, clinical competency committees. We have a milestones guidebook for residents and fellows. On the residents and fellows page, there's even a PowerPoint that was created by the residents and fellows for residents and fellows. So I highly encourage looking at that, and all kinds of other resources. So there's a lot available for you. This supplement for JGME came out in 2021, but it is all about milestones, assessment, and clinical competency committees. Remember, JGME is open access. And so this particular supplement is one that if you would have gotten it in print, you'd have things highlighted, pages folded over, you'd have tabs. It would be one of those sort of documents that you would keep. And with that, I just really want to say thank you. You can reach us anytime. Milestones at acgme.org is the easiest place to do it, simply because my schedule, I never know where I'm going to be. But I am happy to answer any other questions that you have. And like I said, if anybody wants to reach me offline, I'm going to put my email in the chat. And the reason I'm doing that is because it always changes it. So my email isledgar, but everything I do changes it to Ledger, including in the chat here. So I have to go back and change it even in here. So feel free to reach out anytime. Like I said, we are always happy to answer questions in any way that we can. So is there anything else I can do to help you today?
Any other questions, comments?
There was a request for her slides.
Yes, and I think, Dr. Edgar, you sent those to Melissa Bailey, correct?
I did.
So I will end up, when we have this uploaded to the YouTube channel, so you have it interactive, plus the slides, plus for other access, we'll get all of that out to you hopefully by Thursday. Don't hold me to that. But it'll be out to you guys soon. Any other questions, comments? Dr. Edgar, thank you very much, particularly for pivoting at last minute. It's been a real delight, and we will hopefully be able to have you back for follow-up in the future.
Great. Thank you all so much. And again, I appreciate your flexibility. And hopefully you couldn't hear my phone, but all of a sudden it was giving me weather warnings for here now. So I apparently can't get away from it. So thank you, everybody. Have a great afternoon.